Welcome to the bonus round video TFM conclusion. This video serves those of you who have watched my videos on TFM relativism, which is short for True for Me relativism, or if you fancy, Protagorian relativism. I covered a few attacks Robert Kirk makes in his book Relativism and Reality. While Robert Kirk and his work is probably much more well known for zombies, still I think the attacks and things he points out in this particular section of his lesser emphasized and lighter book were a good launching pad for me to make my own kind of move to point out the social impact of TFM. So please watch those videos first, or the full version, full episode 6. If you don't, a lot of the things just might not make sense. But hey, maybe you're here for the challenge, who knows. Basically, I want here to cover a few points to show that we are not ignorant about them, even though some of them I intend to and will cover in more depth and more clarity in the next full episode with Paul O'Grady. There are a few clarifications that might be needed, certainly for someone who has prepared attack responses, or for those of you who just want to be clear about the ideas as much as possible, should definitely watch this video. I will address misleading phrasing in the TFM videos, a relativist-realist picture, a stance that is both relativist and realist at the same time, Kirk's use of the term fact versus my use of the term reality, the limitations on objective language, as well as the limitations and dangers here by the relativists either being unable to state their own position or being forced into self-defeat, which I will call a fork situation, though I keep saying I will talk about this fork in greater detail with Paul O'Grady in the next episode, so don't worry about it, we will definitely see that fork again regardless. I will also address to a certain extent a language game counter and the use of correspondence theory here. And finally, I will address how philosophers may see my agency argument not as all that impressive compared to perhaps the more philosophical gripping fork situation that I mentioned. So while I am covering these things here, a more proper discussion of many of these things will still be left for the next episode anyway. But let's start. Like I said right from the beginning, Kirk, as he states in his preface, wrote this book to intrigue, and it is meant to be accessible without just assuming any kind of philosophical jargon. So perhaps someone already entrenched in philosophy may feel he's using misleading phrases, especially earlier in his book, and many are in this section as it is quite early in the book, and so that may have led me into using similar misleading phrases as well. So please be kind to both of us, keeping in mind this is just one small section of his book, and in many other places he may be addressing some of the issues you feel he has. I'm not covering everything he wrote in that book, and he does take care of many avenues and has what I found were a lot of cool, interesting moves in other places as well. I think one of the problems has much to do with the difference between truth as an ascription versus a property. So I made this image to help explain what's going on. You see, the elliptic relativists cross the limit. That is, they become what I call extreme relativists when they think truth is just this, which excludes the role of a mind-independent objective reality, trying to exclude the parts that are objectively informed, let's say. That is extreme, and we might even therefore call it an anti-realist position, and that's what I keep screaming no about in the earlier part of my videos, and even in the supplementary video for Voodoo Sociology. But as discussed by many of the writers I mentioned, Kirk, O'Grady, Phillips, one can in a sense be relativist and realist at the same time. And I will leave their discussion out, but an example of a relativist-realist is if you include this whole picture of mine. In this whole picture, which is less controversial, what the relativists call truth or facts are just propositions, sentences about how things are that are true, and we give it that value. We are ascribing truth since we judge it as true. Thus, in a sense, we are the ones making a fact, rather than it just being a property of something out there in the world. Both the sentence and the value of truth are given from us to make a fact. But in this whole picture, even if it is ascription going on, those propositions being judged as true, us giving it that value, is dependent relative both to the language we are using, which is us, and the reality within which we are using that language, which is the world. The conditions on which we would ascribe it truth entail the state of the world. In that sense, yes, it is relative to us, but relative to an objective reality also, not just the language or system we are using to state things meaningfully. And in fact, this connection to reality, to an objective reality, a reality about how things are independent of what we think, feel, or believe, is not just necessary connection, but an important connection when we bother to state anything at all. And that's a point that we will see more closely with O'Grady, but I'd like to say here still that even if propositions are thought of as being only minimally informed by reality, like saying something along the lines that propositions being called true is 99.99% dependent on us, our interests, categories, constructs, and only 0.01% on the state of reality, and we'll never even really know which of this proposition is that 0.01% that is reality informed of why we judge it as true. It is still that 0.01% that we care the most about when we care to make an assertion about how things truly are. And a more detailed discussion of that we'll see in the following episode, which I'm in the process of making, crafting, summoning, so stick around. But still, the relativist-realist picture, even if it is including reality too, it is still indeed saying that what we ascribe as truth or fact in part and always will be relative to language, and language depends on our minds, our conceptual, theoretical, and social constructs, no doubt. Indeed, if you are working with this picture and there were no people, no minds, there would be no language, and so no sentences, no propositions, and in that sense there would not be sentences that are true either, no facts without language. So maybe it is a phrasing issue between saying all truths are relative and all of truth is relative, or all truth is all relative, because one can be fine with all truth is relative as a kind of relative realist, but still have an issue with the TFM relativists or other extreme relativists that are ending up promoting a picture that all truths are only or exclusively relative to us, our beliefs, or our language. A picture that defies or denies the importance of truth or facts having such a value because of its dependence also on a shared reality, something other than just you, your language, or your culture. And that is as Kirk tries to paint out what the TFM relativist is doing. But because of this difference, I find myself thinking when it comes to those attacks by Kirk, yes, the relative realist with this picture might, on the one hand, agree and say we can indeed be wrong, so the relativist, the TFM relativist, is wrong, because reality might not be what we assumed, and that does play a role, an essential role, an important role. But no, we agree with the TFM relativist that there cannot be facts unknown. After all, we are the ones that have to make sentences. They aren't just out there in the world without someone having to be there to make them. If all humans or sentient creatures like us that use sentences never existed, there would be no sentences. So there might be a phrasing issue here, because whereas it seems Kirk is using the word facts sort of here in a way some philosophers do where I use reality, the relativist perhaps is using the term facts as saying facts are true propositions, which are sentences, and very obviously sentences belong to a language, a system. So unlike Kirk using words like truths and facts as a kind of component of information which is the state of the world, I try to accommodate the idea that facts or truths could be thought of as propositions that we judge as true by using the term reality, or the world, for what those objective things we judge these propositions to be also relative to. I use the term reality, or mind-independent reality, to describe that which is beyond our perception or what seems to us, beyond our created propositions. But while I thought this is helpful for me to explain it to you guys, or a potential relativist, I admitted this isn't really going to be much of a difference to an extreme relativist either, and so I am forgiving to Kirk using the term facts. And I'll note, firstly, Kirk may be using the term facts to distinguish his position from the position of saying the world is merely as what he calls cosmic porridge, an indeterminate something, and the key component idea, this something has no features on its own, the porridge is undifferentiated. That the world independent of the mind, even if we allow that it exists, is just a kind of grey mush with no distinct information. In fact, it's not even grey, there's just no information, whatever it is. And my use of the term reality might allow that, but he wants to talk about the world as there is some information or some other term about how the world is. But, and secondly, I don't even think that it matters in either case anyway, that I would use the word reality instead of facts. For the extreme relativists wouldn't simply allow for it exists in a non-relative way for reality either, as I keep stating. They would just say that too, the term reality, or cosmic porridge, is just a word in a language, or more closely to what the true for me relativists would say, that they would point out that reality here is just reality for me. So you see, I'm stuck in a way. it is difficult, indeed impossible, for me to properly address what that beyond is in a way, even if I made up a new word. After all, noumena, being beyond the categories of understanding, didn't really save Kant from a similar criticism, and young Wittgenstein on the limits of language might, well, you know what, anyway, don't worry about Kant or young Wittgenstein right now. Just try to see that the committed relativists might always think that they have us caught and stuck because we can never use a word that isn't a part of a language. But if that was the route the TFM relativists wanted to take, if they wanted to get me stuck, captured, cornered, so I can't say anything which isn't merely for me or within a language, then indeed, they're the ones captured as well. In fact, they're cornered into a fork. You see, all of these are words too, even language and the mind, and they too must belong to a language. But that too is just a word in a language, and that too is not an objective description, but a word in a language, and so on infinitely. Because the relativists will never allow one to properly talk about how things are in a usual sense or a philosophic sense, they too cannot do so. They will not allow us or themselves to speak in any sort of meta sense, clear, objective, or usual sense, even to describe their own position. Because of course, all truth is relative. Too is just a sentence or a phrase that they will say, all truth is relative is just true for me. And that too is another sentence, which is just true for me. And that too is just another phrase, which is just true for me, and so on forever. Them always being forced into needing to add more and more as long as they're committed to their position, without ever being able to say finally what their own case is, unless of course they give up and state it clearly. And if they do that, it would be that self-defeating thing I showed you earlier. They will be asserting, saying, taking a position that isn't merely for me. And these same points about how they are either stuck in a position of self-defeat or unable to say their own position because their relative qualifications could go on and on ad infinitum, Kirk brings out in sections 4 and 9 respectively, which I thought was a totally fun and awesome move that I really enjoyed. And maybe it's because I always enjoy when people show how things can go on ad infinitum or in infinite regress. I find that kind of thing really fun. Anyway, this is a fork that they are actually caught in, not us. And I will discuss in my own episode one day, hopefully, how this is more taxing for them than it is damaging for us who oppose them. But anyway, it is just important to point out some of these issues before someone more philosophically inclined tries to jump the gun and attack Kirk or myself in battle, as if one or both of us didn't already know these considerations. And like I said, please subscribe for the next episode so we can talk about these things like self-defeat even more closely. But keep in mind that while I think this sort of discussion is way more philosophically important and engaging, thus my commitment to getting to it, it was left out of this episode because it has little to do with my attack, which was the basis of my wanting to show how Kirk shows TFM leads to solipsism. As for latter Wittgenstein, someone might think that they can do an attack with a language game argument. See, I'm not too down with correspondence theory either. That's why I always try to say tie into reality or influenced by reality, rather than use phrases like point to or pick out, like Kirk does sometimes. Even in sections where he might be talking about Wittgenstein, I felt he was using some misleading phrases that were unfaithful to his latter philosophy, but I find it inconsequential anyway. For example, one might try to counter Kirk's statement about how Earth is the same object to both, and we know from their contradictory statements about the same object that it is a contradiction. But when you move to more sophisticated forms of relativism, for example, a language game argument might be made to show how indeed seemingly opposing statements can mean different things because they are used in different language games, even though it's about the same object. Such as a knife is sharp and a knife is not sharp, about the same knife. Sure, it is the same object, but it is true in one language game the knife is sharp because we're in primary school, so it means, don't give that knife to the 5th graders. But in another game we might say no, the knife is not sharp because we're in the kitchen cooking fish, and saying it's not sharp might mean go get another one or sharpen it. Or for example, a glass with some water in it. It is completely filled and it is not completely filled. In one language game, the chemist is simply pointing out that it's filled with H2O and nitrogen and oxygen and air and everything. It's completely filled. And in another language game, it might not be filled at all. It might be almost nearly completely empty because the physics professor is trying to make a point to his students about mostly empty atoms and the important role of electrons in feeling resistance. These contradictory statements are both true and are about the same object, but it is not really a contradiction because they mean different things depending on their language game, and the game in which these words are used. Okay, so yeah, this could stand against Kirk saying that we know they're contradictory from their contradictory statements about the same thing, but that doesn't really hurt or affect Kirk's actual point that there must be something, a shared something we agree on, that is needed for a contradiction, something we disagree on. And so without a shared anything, there can be no disagreement or agreement. And in my move, I'm using this point to show how it destroys sincere conversation and engagement with each other. Furthermore, later in the book, Kirk does have sections devoted to talking about language game arguments as well, and he provides his counter. Now, whether they are good counters against language game arguments, that's up to you to go ahead and see that battle for yourself. But don't think he doesn't know about this. Check out the rest of his book. Maybe I'm only saying this out of caution for my own self, in case someone thinks I haven't segmented this section out properly, but you know, it's my first time. But also I'm forgiving to the use of correspondence theory here in this section, or even sprinkled throughout. Kirk himself notes the failings of correspondence theory almost right from the get-go, and it is a theory that I disagree with, as I stated, but I would encourage you always to be aware of it, but also be sometimes forgiving of it in places it might have been used, because I know using certain concepts, even if they are flawed or out of date, or not endorsed by you, can still be useful to flesh out our ideas and sentiments or concerns about certain topics in a helpful way, so long as we're careful. Just as using Newtonian science in high school could be helpful to teach students experimentalism, I think it is helpful to teach Popperian falsification to begin understanding the philosophy of science, even if it isn't an accurate picture of how science actually is. It is still a wicked sharp weapon that is useful to learn before transitioning to Kuhnian paradigms, let's say. I myself in this very video use JTB, and I do not endorse JTB or JTB+. I think it is an endeavor fated to fail in ways, but in this case it was still useful to flesh out the differences between someone just making up beliefs and someone who has some justification for their beliefs. So misleading phrases or not, both Kirk and I fleshed out how TFM leads to solipsism, and that was the basis of my decision to cover Kirk here with TFM. Solipsism is called that because it is about no others. It, in a sense, is about people, or lack thereof. And Kirk was able to show that while there is no commitment to the objective truth of others, there is still the truth of one person for the TFM solipsist, which is not for me, a commitment to the objective truth of the existence of one, the solipsists themselves. He shows that true for me must at least be committed to the me. In fact, if you think of someone trying to assert that I exist is only true for me, it's like, wait, what? Aren't you saying that there is you in the first place then? Doesn't there have to be a you before a true for you? Isn't that then assuming something needed to assert the thing we are assuming, like arresting someone for evading arrest? Perhaps I'm not conveying it clearly enough, but I think it's obviously and certainly a troubling situation. But anyway, this TFM relativist is not actually philosophically concerned, they are socially concerned. So they may not know or even care to realize a relativist-realist position, or that they are the ones captured in that fork which involves self-defeat, a seriously damaging criticism. They may have not known or even cared to use a language game argument, or that solipsism has philosophic issues and that their position leads to it. There are indeed more powerful versions of relativism, and we'll get into them. They may care more, but arguably relativists on every level are mostly socially concerned, and that defines their organs, even before more sophisticated ones begin empowering their relativism with stuff they pick up from philosophers like Quine and Tarski and Wittgenstein. They weren't really philosophically concerned to begin with. It's not just different versions of relativism, but on different levels of society, in academia, media, and the bar conversation. They are just much more socially concerned. They are concerned about differing political beliefs, religious beliefs, or cultural beliefs, different worldviews based on race and gender, and so on. So that philosophers can come and have great battle against the relativists that try to empower themselves with Kuhnian, Quinean, and Wittgensteinian language and arguments from many others is great battle and super entertaining, so we'll get to that. But where philosophers point out the philosophic problems with this philosophical stance and take on these philosophic arguments of more powerful relativists, that often misses their organs anyway. They don't seem too bothered by the philosophic issues. So instead, I described TFM as a form of lithic segregation, and from solipsism, which was always about people, showed the outcome, not of philosophic problems, but sociological problems that may come from it, the intolerance that comes from it. I showed instead that it leads to no real conversation. I showed that the true TFM solipsist could not even discuss the possibility of a mind-independent reality and entailing that, the concept of others properly, because those concepts require us to think of them specifically as not for you. They would not honor your independent agency. This shows a socially concerned counter that I called my agency argument. Using this strategy, they can ignore you and your voice and your ability to reflect on as an independent from them agent on a shared reality by saying that's just your truth or that's just true for you. I tried to show that TFM would not honor their concerns about tolerance and diversity, but breed a position more inclined to being close-minded, divisive, and intolerant. Solipsism is not a solution to diversity. It only deepens our division, and I hope that attack reaches someone. So it was much more socially concerned, but indeed there was actually a philosophic underlying basis still. Again, namely that true conversation and engagement require at least two to speak on the same subject, so there is a minimum metaphysical commitment to whatever that shared thing is, and a commitment to others, that they are beyond merely you. It's simply what Kirk pointed out about the shared thing, but because I empowered this to affect those more socially concerned, so they can see the social impact, some philosophically concerned philosophers, they may have then thought it too loose, or, open to attack, a mere social psychoanalytic, not as important as that fork I spoke of earlier, let's say. They may find it more of an emotional appeal, and certainly it could seem so when I ask for something like, please don't segregate us. Anyway, I tried to emphasize how socially damaging it can be going from this to this, and then spoke about the necessity of one shared reality, or paradigm, as a requirement to even address the multiple. And that takes our philosophical reflection well beyond the means of this video here to defeat the TFM relativists anyway, so admittedly in that sense I went plenty far. I need to discuss that in depth to clarify what I'm saying is shared or one. And I didn't really do that here, so I admit the burden still lies on me on my part. For that burden, in that sense, I am perhaps still open to attack. But I will love to really get into that, and we will in the next episode, with what we can learn from Paul O'Grady, and perhaps afterwards with Patrick Phillips. But I wanted to make that on my own standalone video with just me, so I could talk about all this, but I don't know if I deserve that kind of voice yet. I think I might feel better if I had more subs or anything, but anyway, I'm not pressuring you to subscribe or anything. You've already watched up into here, you probably are subscribed, and I probably already pressure you guys too much. Sorry about that. Anyway, so that was the bonus video, TFM conclusion, or whatever I'm calling this thing. Please follow my avatar and we will go into the next episode, which I'm super happy to finally get to. Oh my god, I've been waiting to get to this O'Grady text for so long. Anyway, thanks.